This first session, session 4 on city-to-city learning, is one of the 4 themes within the research program, and we have 4, I think, contrasting but very interesting speakers, and I think we're going to run the same sort of format as before, then get our discussant to try and draw linkages and bring things across the different presentations. But I think the main value is getting the views of the audience and getting them involved in the discussion. So without more ado, Michele, would you like to have your 15 minutes?
Morning, everyone. What we thought we'd kick the session with, or start the session with, is an example of a project that we did over the past 2 years, and how that's evolved. It's sort of a larger project at the moment. Hence, me breaking any form of regulations and rules. The project was and has benefited enormously from the work with the program and with INSIS. And it was originally a project based on looking at how city-to-city learning operates in the climate environment. So it was very much centered around city leadership for climate. And the project has now evolved what we call the City Leadership Lab, which is a very workshopy and a smaller sort of form of what you might have heard at the beginning of the conference from Neil, about the idea of getting PhD students, getting postdocs, getting various members of faculty to chip in ideas about a topic into a workshop. And that's based at UCL Engineering with me at the moment. What I thought I'd do here is give you a very, very brief summary of what sort of things we're doing and why we should care about that kind of people there. I always get a kick out of pictures of bars, but I will change targets soon, hopefully. But for those of you that don't know, that's the Mayor of London. I'm assuming everyone does know. Then, what's the project about? What do we do with the City Leadership Lab? The basic idea is quite simple, and it's so that we can have, we're missing David Satterwhite in the room, but it was really an idea that David had quite a few years ago. And what David had done at the time, this is about 5 years ago, he started questioning who actually works or who is in charge in cities. There's a lot of talk, and we've seen in a bunch of versions throughout all the various sessions. There's a lot of talk, obviously, about urbanization, lots of talk about different modes of grappling with that, lots of talk about big picture of the city, different versions of urbanization and urban theory. So planetary urbanization, we've seen suburbanism, global suburbanism, we've seen, if you go in policy circles, there's not a single conference that doesn't tell you, if you haven't heard, that most of the world actually now lives in cities, which might blow you away to know. But what we're interested in is who are the people that are in charge, that are shaping the cities, and what can they actually do. And what David had done was a very simple exercise. He just simply looked at who was talking about mayors, for example, in the urban studies literature, pointing out that basically more than 50–60% of the actual urban studies, broadly construed literature, talks about mayors. And yet the systematic analysis of what they do, who they are, what they can do, what kind of powers do they have, is extremely, extremely limited. Or it's considered a bit old-fashioned. It's considered old political sciencey things. So what we're doing with the City Leadership Lab is we're starting with some analysis that Arab has done as well, pretty well, in the climate scenario, looking at the powers, looking at what actual powers do city leaders have around the world, what things can they actually do, and then focusing, and I promise I'd skip all the theory so I don't piss off Alex on too much assemblage theory or A&T or versions of, plus we've got Colin in the room, so we've got stage fright on that. So I won't give you much theory, but what we're trying to do is how do city leaders put together their visions, their ideas of what a city looks like into a concrete assemblage, a concrete tool like a city strategy. And by city strategy, I'll show you there's a vast variety, but we're really meaning an actual concrete materialization of how we think through the evolution of a city. And what we're doing is trying to compare or put together better the powers and the things that mayors can do and city leaders can do with the things that they want to do, the strategies, or with the things that they are told to do. And on that, we're trying to look at what sort of influences and what sort of networks of institutions shape this sort of things. Because this is a project that is very much oriented to the international, but also because this is a project that is extremely concerned about the impact, about the everyday impact of all this city leadership talk. We are essentially in the first two stages of the project at the moment. So the initial two stages are running between this year and the middle to the end of next year. And since it's early in the morning, I thought I'd give you a very confusing chart. I'm trying to get you dizzy. This is sort of just to give you a vague idea of the spread that we're trying to do. One thing we did in the city leadership project on climate was to focus on a specific network. So we looked at the climate leadership group, the C40. It has a set number of members, it's 60 cities worldwide. They're all fairly, they call them mega cities, or they call large cities, they call them global cities. Working with Jenny Robinson, I'm not allowed to use the term. What we're trying to do with this, so the expansion of that idea, is to go beyond the single network, to get a representation of cities worldwide. And what we're doing is, first of all, getting the largest cities, and then getting a secondary city every time we get a large city. Trying to compare, for example, what is the internal difference in states around the world. So that's roughly what it is. It's about 135 cities. Thus far, we're at the 100 mark. And what we're very simply doing is a very simple exercise at the very beginning, is collecting the strategies, engaging with these cities and asking them whether they have strategies, what set of strategies do they have, and trying to figure out what sort of trends are there in the sort of strategies that these cities are putting forward. So that to clarify that this is not environmental centric. This is not actually focused on any thematic area. It is focused on the tool itself, the strategy, and then it gets compared across various thematic areas. So that's a rough spread. I'll get rid of that so you don't get dizzy. But that's the sort of things that we're looking into. To give you just a very quick snapshot of strategies that are out there. You're probably very familiar with most of them, if not all of them. The London Plan, the Singapore Blueprint, Plan NYC, the Vancouver Plan, Hong Kong Plan, Sydney Plan, the Dubai Plan. There's a myriad of this. As Jenny said, this has literally become a ubiquitous technology of urbanization and of urban politics. That up there is roughly of the cities we've looked at the moment, who has a strategy, who is developing a strategy, citywide strategy, and who doesn't. Just to give you a quick snapshot of actually pretty much everyone has a strategy, and who the ones that don't are rushing to get something out, to get a statement of what they want to be and what they can do and what they would like to be in the near future. What we're doing is trying to understand what goes on in that box and trying to understand, or in that part of the chart, and trying to understand how the existing is being modified by other ideas floating around. And this also to give you a sense that, number one, city leaders are not just mayors, and that's the major challenge actually of the project. That the idea of the mayor, especially the democratically elected mayor, is quite widespread, but not the only form of city leadership. So some of you might be familiar with that guy there, and that's an actual sheikh. That's the Sheikh of Dubai. He's a very flamboyant man. Not as flamboyant as the King of Manila or the Mayor of Manila, if you want. It depends on the day and how he feels like it. But it's very, very different people. That's what I'm trying to get through. And it's very, very different cultural, social, at times even explicitly racial contexts. I thought what would be useful, rather than flood you with stats and graphs and trends and numbers at an early hour of the morning, I'll just very briefly give you a snapshot of what they're actually saying. So what are these strategies and what are these leaders projecting to the wider world and to their own people as well, as to what is the role of city leadership in the broader, not just in their own context, but in the broader scenario. What do city leaders say about them being capable of doing things globally or internationally? Drawing a bit of what we did on climate, turned out that the rhetorics are not that different, but also the statements and the commitments are not that different. The general discussion that you find with city leaders is that they present themselves as central. The whole point of reiterating 1 million times that more than half of the world's population lives in cities is also a rhetoric of centrality, of the fact that cities sit in the middle of a number of challenges. And when that's done, that's generally done not just to point out that cities are creating these challenges, but more importantly, sort of to point out that they are capable of dealing with those challenges. There's a continuous rhetoric and there's a continuous statement on the fact that cities have the powers to tackle things like climate change, have the capacity to develop networks and institutions to deal with things like urban safety, to deal with things like inequality. And especially thanks to things like the C40, things like UNHABITAT and so forth, the statement has become also a statement of proactivity. The cities don't have to wait for other institutions to engage them into dealing with problems. That rather it is up to cities to act on a number of things and to do it regardless of whatever else anyone else is doing. The way they do that, quite blatantly and even fairly, if we want to put it this way, leftist mayors, the rhetoric is actually a fairly hybrid, a fairly generally blatantly neoliberal rhetoric of dealing with these problems in the world we live in. That's a quote from Ken Livingstone. So it'll surprise you perhaps to think of Ken as someone that is just fine with big business, but the general statement you find around the world on this is, well, these are the conditions we're forced to work in. If these are the conditions, how can we bend the conditions, the institutions, the financing, to actually get things done in cities? So blatantly hybrid. And the last bit that I thought I'd put forward that we think is the most important, and we think is the most important because the scope of this project is actually then taking all this global overview to the ground, to PhD, postdocs, and early career researchers that work on the ground of these cities that are already there, that we don't send there, and get them to evaluate what the stuff looks like if you're standing on a street or in a public toilet in Mumbai. And the reason for doing that is that the linchpin of all this strategy discussion, strategy production, is a narrative of responsibility, is a narrative of leadership is responsibility. We are responsible for the challenges that we've created, we are responsible for people, we're responsible for taking action. What we're trying to do with the lab is to create a more reflexive form of responsibility, then look at how other mayors, other city leaders project themselves and act as responsible. That's a very quick snapshot. I won't take much stuff, but this is the sort of things that we're doing now. They're just funny tools to deal with, but this is the sort of things that you see city leadership and city strategies are talking about. And you'll find some common and classic friends, global and livable, even if when you go at 120 cities mark, are still the things that cities want to do. But to give you a sense of other things that they do. And what we find very important is this bit here, is the fact that they say we can do things, we are doing things, and look at us, we are doing things. I'll skip over this bit. in the sense of, as I was trying to say, there's a blatant challenges in doing all of this, especially if you've seen our gracious mayor flapping about. And I'll wrap up by saying two challenges very quickly. One challenge is when you look at these strategies, when you look at the rhetoric, you actually look at a whole bunch of people proposing a whole lot of technological solutions. They're great. These things are fantastic in Rio de Janeiro, for example, but they need to be dealt with a clear eye on the responsibility, with a clear eye that the sort of linkages that you get to create these massive technological solutions are actually embedded in geographies of responsibilities that are changing. So to wrapping up, that's the sort of stuff we're doing. As if we're not hanging out in parks with him. I'm going to move on from that. What we're trying to do is to keep an eye on city leadership, do it globally, trying to decenter as much as possible. This is a quintessential global north rhetoric. And to try to keep an eye on city leadership to engage with them, and to engage with the next year of city leadership, because, to close it there, our main concern is then going to the corner shop. Our main concern is taking all this stuff down to the street. That's the second stage of the lab. The reason why we're doing it is we are actually seriously concerned about the fact that then this could very easily become just a very nice global package of ideas. How do the ideas become what you buy in that corner shop? And that's my longer than 15 minutes. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Michele. I think that gives us a really good starting point, and now we want to try and move on to look at how different agencies in different parts of the world have actually related to this agenda about city-to-city learning that we've just heard about. And I'm very pleased to welcome Juma Assiago from UNHABITAT.
Thank you very much, and good morning to you all. This morning I have been asked by Michele to give a reflection and put a particular case in mind around safety in cities, that we could look at city leadership and the whole aspect about how city leaders translate their vision into city strategies, and to see whether this as an arena of city-to-city learning presents us with some thoughts about how to keep an eye on city leadership and look at it from a global perspective. As you know, UNHABITAT within the United Nations system has been considered as the key focal agency for local governments. And way back in '96, there was the whole conversation about how cities begin to move from the conception of local government to local governance, in which the different other stakeholders and partners that have come into the functioning of cities need to be recognized as equal partners to local government. At the same time, looking at cities from a multi-level governance approach, there needs to be a little bit more tighter coordination of the institution of local government to the various ways in which the state and the national government see or perceive the local. Now, for Habitat since '96, it has been promoting a program that is known as the Safer Cities program. And the program basically has taken up an issue which is a non-traditional subject for cities, as an issue that remains to this very day a preserve of national government, seen very much in a very securitized way, and that looks at a sectoral way of delivery of safety through the institutions of policing and the penal justice system. The Safer Cities program was tasked with the idea of building an approach that looks at crime and violence as an issue of better urban planning, better urban management, better urban governance, and basically look at it as in terms of both process and content. This presented safety as a common good, as an issue that requires not just the police itself, but the whole citizenry to assume common responsibility for crime and violence prevention and reduction. It also comes in a moment in time when we look at both the North and the South grappling with issues of safety on basically the same footing. Among the various issues that cities are confronting, safety appears to be one of those that the North and that cannot actually be labeled or contextualized as just a Southern problem, but appears to have a common resonance in approach both in the North and the South. Whether looking at it from what Saskia Sassens puts forth as a global city concept, or whether looking at what Mike Davis presents from the Global South as the planet of slums. And this is particularly, I picked up some of the slides from a course I did here under Dr. Howard, which basically presents really how we look at cities today. And this is Sao Paulo, where the urban divide is very telling. And in a context like this, putting safety into the perspective shows you exactly why safety needs to be looked at in a much broader perspective of urban planning, governance, and urban management. Now, looking at city leaders and how city leaders build coalitions of stakeholders around this subject matter, we have, within the last 17 years, been applying the safety approach in 77 cities around the world in Africa, Latin America, Asia Pacific. And what comes very telling in this is the way the approach has evolved over time. We started off with the city of Johannesburg in '96, where we applied the very rigorous way of looking at prevention of urban crime from the social, institutional, and situational perspective. But over time, integrated into the urban fabric, cities begin to see themselves looking at safety from a multi-dimensional perspective, linking it to insecurity of tenure, and also into natural disasters. And finally, flipping it from looking at safety as just a challenge into an opportunity to enhance livable places and spaces. This, of course, was what was the '96 approach, which looked at crime prevention as an issue of institutional, social, and environment design, but largely fell into a difficult implementation plan vis-a-vis national government that provided the facilitating framework of national crime prevention strategies, but that did not see the local government as the local interface, rather the police station. Now, coming to the next approach, this is now a more integral way, which, for example, is akin to Medellin in its integrated approach to crime and violence, where safety is not just seen from a perspective of crime, but also looked at from a multidimensional aspect to the strengths that local government presents. And again, built around a coalition, safety is also looked at from the causation of crime, where a rigorous diagnosis at a citywide scale is conducted by the local government, which translates into the city strategy that brings all the different stakeholders together and then moves into the implementation and institutional part. And this begins to become the basis around which city-to-city learning and city-to-city networking and training begins to take shape. And of course, with this, Habitat has now brought together a safer cities model, which increasingly is deriving tools, necessary tools that integrate crime within the wider urban development plan. Now, what some of the lessons that we have basically brought out in terms of this very interesting arena of debate and conversation of city leadership is that we need to begin to start thinking of institutional changes that place local government at the center of the way we perceive the local. And I know yesterday we spoke to the different ways and concepts of looking at city based on national census data and population, but this exactly is where we need to understand that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. And we need to begin to understand the local customs and values of what the city has and what it perceives to be local government. Again, the way local government relates within a multi-level governance arena is key to the way city leadership needs to be perceived. Again, a multi-sectoral thinking is really the emphasis that city leadership provides more than what national provides in its structure and file. And that is a value addition that I think could be used to harness an urban conversation around issues of safety and security and translate into what we are fundamentally building in terms of livable places and spaces. 2 years ago, this whole knowledge that UNHABITAT brought together over the last 17 years was translated into the launch of a global network on safer cities. The appreciation of this was not just from the perspective of what Habitat has done, but to also acknowledge the fact that at the time where that various international agencies have actually taken up the idea of safety as a prerequisite to urban development, and that the need now is more apparent than ever before to present to cities an integrated, an integral approach on safety that is not flop-sided of in one way or another. The network on safer cities is supposed to provide cities an opportunity to have a collective approach between the various international agencies, international actors, universities, towards the focus of what the safety approach in cities needs to fundamentally look like. In this, we have basically created 5 or 6 objectives to enhance the safer cities know-how and experience and make this accessible to the international community. We are working on UN-wide guidelines on safer cities as a basis to city learning. We are also building in a toolkit that cities themselves will champion via centers of excellence around the world. Centers of excellence principally being a university partnering with a local government in its jurisdiction to provide that practice available to other cities in the country, in the region, and globally. Already we have, for example, picked Cape Town. That is beginning. That I think we would be able to hear more from Susie. Yes, no, but at some point probably in the comments, where the Africa Center for Cities has actually taken root in the University of Cape Town, and will probably provide the city of Cape Town, that has already implemented a violence prevention through urban upgrading approach, a way to bridge research and practice, and then embody this to the nation and to the region of Africa. The same also applies in Santiago de Chile, where we have linked up with the University of Alberto Hurtado and the municipality of Santiago. The case also of Sydney, Australia, where the University of Sydney has also teamed up with the City of Sydney that approaches safety more from a nighttime policy perspective. And all this is basically on the basis of practice, building us into a conversation about how the cities have in practice been able to address safety from their core mandates and core strength at a global level. I think the potential dilemmas that we face in terms of this city-to-city networking is whether to formalize this global network or whether to just leave it as an amorphous way in which cities are able to interact amongst themselves based on practice. The second element that we, I think, are grappling with is is the number of requests that come to the table to be part of this network, and what basically could we really use? Do we look at the quality of the approach, which of course then demands time, in which 3 years at minimum, in which a city needs to carry out this development and implementation of city crime prevention strategies. The third element, of course, is funding. Cities in their nature, very few cities have international relations as a department or as a budgeted area within their structure and file. And therefore, trying to facilitate this international city-to-city learning proves to be a challenge from a perspective of sustainable funding. Going into the next steps, we look at the next 2-3 years as really an opportunity to the Habitat 3 conference in 2016 to really develop a functioning city-to-city networking and training program that engages the universities with cities within their jurisdiction, but also to make that as the framework around which we can be able to look at city leadership from a global perspective. And in this context, I would obviously open the floor to this gathering to think through possibly ways in which, using this as one of the spaces, we could actually bring together this city-to-city learning experience to fruition. Thank you.
We've now got a really nice perspective on issues related to crime, violence and safety at the international level. We now change gear again and focus, as I understand it, very much on one location, Solo in Indonesia, and I hand the floor to Tim.
Well, good morning everyone, and thanks to Michele and folks here at the Future Cities programme for inviting me to join these discussions. I've learned a lot already, so thank you very much. I begin with mention of some work by the discussant for this session. Kevin Ward, and along with Eugene McCann, has written recently about how city policymakers today increasingly scan the world for models and good practices from which they may learn. My own recent research in Indonesia has shown plenty of evidence of such scanning, including the case of Solo or Surakarta in central Java, which is the main site in my current research and the main focus of this presentation. City policymakers in Solo and elsewhere in Indonesia look to learn from supposedly good practices in other cities near and far. So with the assistance of the Japanese International Cooperation Agency, Greater Makassar in South Sulawesi has sought to become the Curitiba of Indonesia. Curitiba being one of the cities mentioned in Kevin Ward and Eugene McCann's article on these usual suspects. The city of Bandung in West Java has looked at Glasgow's arts incubator as part of its own plans to become a creative city. Much closer to the Indonesian archipelago, lots of cities look to Singapore as a model in terms of urban planning or design. And finally, Solo itself, the city of Solo, has emerged as something of a domestic model. So before looking at Solo in more detail, it's important to recall that there are long histories of urban planners and policymakers seeking to learn from other cities near and far, something that was considered at the early career workshop that was held on Wednesday. At the same time, there's a sense, especially from the burgeoning literature on policy mobilities, that there is something new or distinctive about intercity learning over the past decade, or perhaps the past 2 decades or so. In part, this seems to have something to do with the speed of policy travels. Certainly, it's also cast as having something to do with a wider era of neoliberalism, with certain kinds of fast policy understood as both effects and agents of neoliberalisation. In the case of Indonesia, it's possible to trace a proliferation of city-to-city learning efforts to the onset of democratic decentralisation following President Suharto's forced resignation in the late 1990s. Now, clearly I don't have time to go into detail of these changes, but I just wish to point to 4 key dimensions here on the slide. Firstly, this is associated with new fiscal relations, including emphasis on locally generated revenues by newly autonomous local government jurisdictions. Secondly, when we talk about local here, what we mean is precisely cities and also regencies, kabupaten, that together constitute the 3rd tier of administration in Indonesia. Thirdly, the kinds of changes that I'm talking about are very much in line with World Bank governance prescriptions, rationalised by possibilities for local experimentation, innovation, and programs which are locally responsive. And yet, and this is the final bullet point here, democratic decentralization in Indonesia is definitely not reducible to such external influences or neoliberal prescriptions. So, regional autonomy was also very much a response to regional demands and to associated fears of national territorial disintegration or balkanization in the late 1990s. This image is one cartographic imagining of what a territorially fragmented Indonesian archipelago could have looked like. Right? If this had become geopolitical reality, the city of Solo would have been part of the Republic of Java. That didn't happen, and Solo actually forms part of Jawa Tengah, Central Java, the capital city of which is Semarang, and Solo is somewhere here. So there you can see Semarang, the capital of the province, and also Surakarta towards the southeast there. So, what are the outcomes of what is now over well over a decade of regional autonomy, and how has Solo come to emerge as a model in this context? Well, again, to cut a potentially very long story short, appraisals or evaluations of democratic decentralization, regional autonomy in Indonesia have overwhelmingly been negative. Focus on corruption, the rescaling of predatory politics, lots of perspectives on a lack of local government capacity and resources. And this is precisely what's fostered efforts, in many cases, to learn from elsewhere, to learn how to improve in the delivery of services, how to generate local income. So cities have turned to or have been approached by agencies like JICA that I mentioned earlier. They've increasingly scanned for international models for local economic development, planning and design. And as I've said, there's also been more recently the emergence of some local or domestic models. In part, this has emerged from a proliferation of rankings of city performance, often to do with business rankings. There have also been profiles of good practices. The top image on the slide here is one such booklet produced by an organisation called Apexi. And connecting with the topic of Michele's presentation, profiles of mayoral leadership. So the image at the bottom of the slide there from Tempo magazine shows 10 local government leaders who were profiled by Tempo magazine as they put it, 10 good men from across a vast archipelago. It's in 2008. If you did this exercise today, there'd probably be at least one woman, I'm happy to say. So Joko Widodo, the mayor of Solo, is amongst these so-called 10 good men as supposedly good leaders by Indonesian standards. He's since become vaunted as a great leader by international standards. So this is an image of a book that I saw in Solo. Joko Widodo left of Queen Elizabeth there as a great leader, which also includes Warren Buffett. I didn't buy this book, I just took a photograph of it. Now, Joko Widodo, also known as Jokowi, ran a successful furniture business before running for mayor. But importantly, for me at least, his perceived successes as a leader are not merely or even primarily, I think, to do with making Solo business friendly. Rather, Solo under Jokowi's leadership became best known for two things. Firstly, the amicable, equitable relocation of squatters along a flood-prone riverbank, and also informal street vendors. And then secondly, on the right, the upgrading or rejuvenation of traditional markets, in some cases to house some of the informal street vendors that were relocated. So these two aspects of Solo alone have made the city a very popular destination for study tours. With the exception of the thick dotted lines on this map, the lines show study tours to Solo during the period 2009-2010. So you can see study tours from within Java and proximate islands, from across the archipelago, and internationally too. So I'm interested in what these lines mean, partly because that relates to wider issues of intercity learning that motivate this panel, but partly because I think there do seem to be some genuinely socially progressive aspects to Solo as model. So part of what I'm doing at the moment in Solo is to look critically at those good practices that the city's become famed for. Practices that some of you no doubt were thinking just now don't sound particularly socially progressive, so evictions, relocation of squatters and street vendors. So let me just elaborate a little bit. So to start with the left column here, riverbank resettlement. The riverbanks have been flood prone for many years. There was one particularly bad flooding event in December 2007, after which the mayor initiated a series of negotiations. In some cases this was the first time that communities had ever had a really meaningful connection with local government. They eventually came to some kind of agreement for relocation. This included land titling, relocation to land where former squatters were given land title, and thereby hopefully some kind of land tenure, although I recall Colin McFarlane's comment yesterday that that's not necessarily guaranteed, and that's something that I'll be looking at over the next few years. But also finally, this is the bottom image of the left-hand side here. When these folks were relocated, the land was not merely being appropriated for the construction of a mall or for riverside residences, it's become a public park. And similarly, to turn to the right-hand side, areas of the city that were previously occupied by street vendors have not been appropriated to construct a new commercial development. They have been opened as public and civic spaces. Those people who were relocated again by negotiation, over many rounds of negotiation, were either moved into rejuvenated traditional markets or newly constructed ones, as shown in the image on the right there. And finally, it's worth pointing out that, again, under Mayor Jacobi's leadership, a series of local regulations were brought into place that restricted the development of supermarkets, shopping malls, and even mini-marts like your equivalent to 7-Eleven within a certain distance of traditional markets. So Jacobi, I think it's fair to say, has generally been considered to have been a people-centred mayor. And it's on the basis of that reputation and that perception that he was able to become governor of Jakarta last year, and now the rumours are that he may become the next president of Indonesia. So the question for me then is whether the at least partly socially progressive Solo model is having similarly largely positive impacts elsewhere in the face of all this overwhelmingly negative appraisal of decentralisation in Indonesia and of policy mobility as neoliberalisation in the wider literature. That means turning back to these lines on the map, and what they mean or what they amount to. And this in turn I think means a need to consider territorial political dimensions. What are the motivations of local policymakers who adopt or seek to adopt Solo as model? What are the local political struggles and stakes concerned? And I have to admit that I haven't got very far in answering those questions yet, so I kind of join the chorus of people who are prescribing multi-site ethnography without actually doing it myself, unfortunately. What I have done recently is begun a collaborative project with my anthropologist colleague Eric Thompson in Singapore for examination of Pak Red, which is the top left there. It says Bangkok on the slide, but Pak Red is actually a separate municipality that forms part of Greater Bangkok, and my colleague Eric has now started to work there. Members of the municipality sought to learn from Solo in implementing a traditional market rejuvenation project of its own, and visited Solo with assistance from an organisation called the Partnership for Democratic Local Governance in Southeast Asia, DELGOC. So, working collaboratively across the two sites and considering the role of DELGOC, our intention is to carry out a detailed examination of the politics of the adoption of Solo as model in Pak Red. But as I say, we've only recently started that task. So I conclude by reflecting upon how this ongoing work relates to the wider literature and the topic of this session on city-to-city learning. First, many scholars have been critical of the whole framing of learning in terms of city A to city B, so in our case Solo to Pak Red. Often they consider cities as much more complex assemblages or reassemblages of lots of diverse elsewheres. Fair enough, I respect that work and continue to read it. But I also think that empirically one has to start somewhere and from some point in time. Surely some transnational tracts are more significant than others. Some origins, in scare marks, are more worthy of attention than others perhaps. Those from the global south or beyond the usual suspects that appear on those mental maps of policymakers. Leaving aside the seemingly problematic issue of origins and destination, is the city the correct unit of analysis? Again, something that Colin McFarlane alluded to yesterday. Usually good practices are actually associated with a specific policy, a specific project or site. Yet it remains the city, capital C, toponym, that continues to be marked on policy actors' mental maps. And this smacks of this whole notion of methodological cityism, a term which is, appears in a much anticipated forthcoming article in International Journal of Urban and Regional Research. Finally, I think whatever the unit of analysis, there is clearly a need for detailed examination of the local territorial politics through which antecedent models and best practices are adopted and affect change in diverse elsewheres. To the extent that this involves multiple sites, perhaps sites in multiple national contexts, such work, it seems to me, is almost certainly going to be beyond the capacity of any single lone researcher. And so perhaps there's a growing need for forms of collaborative academic learning of the kind that Garth Myers has recently written about. Thank you very much.
Our final presentation in this session is on the perspective from the World Bank Institute, and it's a great pleasure to invite back to St Anne's, I can say, Abha Joshi-Ghani, who will tell us about the work that they've been doing on city-to-city learning.
Morning, everybody. I think we had an excellent discussion on city-to-city learning, on leadership, on crime and violence, and how exactly do cities learn. So I just wanted to, in a way, wrap it up and say how do actually cities learn in a practical way, and what the World Bank is doing. So just to focus the discussion. So where are we today in terms of urbanization? And all of us in this room know that we have about more than 2 billion, actually almost 3 billion people moving to cities in 2030, and of which 95% of this movement is going to take place in developing countries. And why are cities important? They actually contribute 70% to the global GDP, and as Steve would say, they also contribute about 80% of GHG gas emissions. So it's a huge challenge, and it's also a huge opportunity. So what is happening to cities? Cities that call themselves global cities, how are they managing themselves? What are they learning? So let's have a look at Cairo. Let's have a look at Kampala in Uganda. And let's have a look at Mumbai. And here we are talking about huge, large metropolitan cities. If this is how big global cities, prominent cities are managing themselves, then let's imagine what are intermediary or small cities doing, which are actually taking most of this population growth. So what we know today, as Paul Romer says, we have peak urbanization and we have really low capacity in cities to manage this urbanization. Cities are overwhelmed, they are bursting at the seams. And what are the key issues there? It's governance and leadership, as Michele said. Service delivery, how do you actually provide water, sanitation, roads, and housing to the people who are coming into cities? Informality, both economic informality in terms of people who are outside of regulated jobs and economy. And you'll be surprised to know that, for example, in India, in the large cities, 80% of the economy is informal. And informality means entrepreneurship, and it means innovation, but it also means a lack of safety nets and people falling into extreme poverty once things happen. Informality is also in terms of informality of housing, so we have slums and shacks and townships. Sustainability, how do we sustain this kind of resource use, the kind of GHG gas emissions, congestion, air pollution. Resilience. Today we know that at least 300 million people are affected by living next to the sea on coastal cities, and just regular flooding, earthquakes, and just general resilience of cities. How do cities learn to be resilient? And competitiveness. If 70% of GDP is being produced by cities, then they are the focus of economic competitiveness in most countries, although national governments may not necessarily recognize that. So how do overwhelmed cities actually make themselves competitive and attract investment, attract entrepreneurs, attract educated and skilled people? So we talked a little bit this morning about city-to-city learning, about how, you know, Solo wants to be a Curitiba, and what are cities doing. And we know that there are a lot of traditional forms of city learning. So we know about city twinning, and not so long ago I was with a delegation from Ho Chi Minh, and we were in New York City, and they said, oh, but we are twinned with Lyon in France, and we don't want to be like them. We want to be like New York. So, you know, the traditional twinning is kind of a little bit outdated. We also have today very prolific and dynamic city networks and associations. So we have the UCLG and Metropolis and so on. We have a huge amount of study visits which take place, which are just in time and demand driven. And then we have accreditation programs and certification in LEED and green growth and so on. But city-to-city learning, it has to be, you know, today we talk about smart cities, and the moment we talk about smart cities, we think of technology and innovation, and we think of, you know, cars parking themselves and lights turning themselves off. But what Tim Campbell calls smart cities is really how do cities actually learn from each other. And what he finds in the map that you see is that there is a movement of cities going to each other to learn from each other. So there's a huge demand of cities wanting to learn from other cities. They don't want to learn from academia or from international organizations. They really want to see how does this actually work on the ground. But the problem is that the lessons are not being captured. They are not being codified. They are not being curated in a way that it's really systematic, that these are all very individual efforts. So there has to be the art and science of knowledge exchange. How do we do this systematically? So, you know, if cities are learning from each other and they are not learning too well, then, or they are learning well, then what are the elements of successful city-to-city learning? We find today that this old idea of cities from the south should learn from cities from the north is actually pretty archaic and gone. It's a very, very multi-directional learning, and really what I want to say is that most cities in the south want to learn from other cities in the south, because although when Hanoi wants to be like New York, it's actually quite aspirational, and that's a fantastic goal to have. But they also know that their resources, the sort of problems they face day to day, is, you know, something which is happening in Hanoi is probably, you know, more akin to what's happening in Kampala or in Dar es Salaam or even in Solo, but not necessarily what New York is doing or what London is doing. So, you know, it's more south-to-south learning. And what cities want to know is, you know, can we verify what happened? Is there a way to codify it? Is there a way to establish the relevance and customize it? And the problem in that is that what we find today is that there's a sheer lack of city data. So if you're looking at data-driven, evidence-based learning, we don't really find it. And that's this whole, and that is the science and art of knowledge exchange. So what is the World Bank Institute doing about this? The World Bank Institute is the learning arm of the World Bank. And the key thing here is that we feel that, you know, the World Bank itself produces more than $500 million worth of knowledge every year. Very little actually gets translated into practitioner learning. So the moment we are talking about learning and capacity building, we have to think about how do we take knowledge and actually translate it into practitioner learning, connect practitioners south-south, north-south, and how to do the practical way of the how-to of things and not just the why and the what of things. We also know today of what Joe Stiglitz calls the big step, that, you know, it's innovation which leads to huge transformations. It's not just doing little things every day. So we also look at, incubating innovations and scaling up. And then, of course, everything has to be, we're focused into collaborative governance, so bringing multiple stakeholders around an issue. So if you're talking about a city, it's not just the leadership, it's not just the municipal administration, it's the citizens, it's the community-based organizations, it's the private sector, and we tend to leave all the parties involved in making a city livable, sustainable out if we are just thinking about city administration. So a more comprehensive, collaborative way of looking at cities. And then there's the idea of, how do you actually take evidence-based learning? How do you actually take data and interpret it in such a way that your learning is constantly iterative and you are changing your application and you're actually moving forward? And we call that the science of delivery. And it's really looking at how do you incubate new solutions, you try them, you scale them up, you accelerate them, and not just from within the World Bank Group, but a whole lot of innovation is happening outside and in small places and large places and other institutions and academia. So it's just a way of doing iterative learning and constantly enhancing that. I'll just go through this very quickly. So we have a whole lot of ways of, or menu of products that we offer. There's the E-Institute for practitioner learning, the South-South Knowledge Exchange, which actually helps with the codification of knowledge between cities in the South, or just governments the South, and helps them how to codify and systematize this knowledge exchange, innovative solutions, and collaborative governance. So I just wanted to talk about a few examples of a different way of city to city learning. And one of the most recent things that we did was, New York was launching its fourth regional plan, and we thought, how about making this into actually a living lab? And could we bring major cities from our development partners from the 6 regions of Africa, South Asia, East Asia, Latin America, and Europe and Central Asia, and see if these cities would actually learn from New York, customize it, adapt it, but actually have a living metropolitan lab. So we've got a living real-time learning going on. It was launched this April. It's a 3-year process, and we have 15 cities from the 6 regions. And there are multiple modalities of doing this. So there's intensive face-to-face learning, but then we also have created communities of practice. So people continue to talk to each other. We use webinars, peer-to-peer learning, and then e-learning. And we realized that we really do need to move away from the traditional ways of learning into what we call the new delivery method of education and learning, which is the digital university. So we are using a lot of digital media to scale up learning, because there's no way that you can actually train 400 million city officials in China through face-to-face learning. So we are doing that. And as you can see, it's, the learning is pretty cross-sectoral. So if Mumbai only wants to learn about planning, and if Dar es Salaam only wants to learn about service delivery, then they can choose what they want to learn out of this lab and focus on that, and actually have smaller communities of practice around their issues. The other one is strengthening capacities in Southeastern Europe, and we have about 27 municipalities which get together, look at their finances, look at governance, leadership, and there's an amazing interaction going on, all in terms of social accountability, governance, corruption, service delivery, and so on. Participatory budgeting, it's something which started in Porto Alegre, actually in 1989, and today about 300 million people in Brazil are involved in participatory budgeting, and about 1,500 cities. And it's moved from Latin America, I would say from Brazil into Latin America, and now into North America, Asia, Africa, Europe. So here we see learning which is coming from south to the north. So it is actually multi-directional, and has significantly improved the lives of citizens. Scaling up of South-South learning, I talked about codification, a systematic way of doing this, and it's really identifying what is good practice, best practice. So for example, water and sanitation in Brazil, or urban transport in Nigeria. How do we help La Mata in Nigeria to actually be able to help other cities who want to learn from La Mata in urban transport. How do you codify knowledge? How do you actually exchange that without being overwhelmed? If you have 400 city delegations visiting you, like New York does or Seattle does, how do you actually govern a city while receiving all these delegations? And then it's the client learning through e-institute. I talked about digital learning. We're also now starting on massive online open courses. I'm not sure if Oxford University is part of of any of this now, but I know that Edinburgh is, and USA has some massive coalitions like Stanford leading Coursera, and MIT and Harvard leading edX. Where it's basically a matter of advocacy and building up awareness, and we also do facilitated courses for that. And then our aspirational goal now, what we're doing now, is looking at reimagining learning through the open learning campus. So we are going massively into a digital and physical way of taking knowledge to practitioners as practical learning of how to of things, which would include the World Bank Academy, which are really courses, World Bank Talks, which are like TED Talks. People learn a lot from 3-minute podcasts and hot topic discussions rather than, I can't imagine a mayor sitting in front of a computer for 10 hours taking an online course, but I can imagine him or her downloading something, let's say public-private partnerships, if they were doing a road project in that, on a mobile app and looking at it. So, and then building communities of practice, which is really peer-to-peer learning. So this is where we are. And I would just say that I think that the way that cities can actually meet the challenges of today and really take the opportunity which urbanization is presenting to nations, find a way so that people are not confined to rural poverty. There is no future in rural poverty. What we have to do is help cities govern themselves, help them provide that the services to their citizens, and quintessentially provide the ladders of wealth that only cities can create for people coming to cities. So let's put those opportunities out for people coming to cities and let cities actually transform countries and lead them into development. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Before we open the floor to discussion, I'd like to ask Kevin Ward from the University of Manchester to try and bring out some of the themes and highlights as he sees from these 4 presentations that we've just heard from.
Okay, I'll do my best. Okay, so thank you to all those involved in organising the event, and thank you to the 4 speakers. 4 very interesting and provocative talks, I think. There were plenty of similarities and differences running across them, and so I'll be brief. In the next, I guess, 4 to 5 minutes, I just want to focus on the similarities and raise 6 points. I guess not just for the speakers, but for all of us, whether you're involved in your day job, in cities learning from each other, or like me, you're interested in the mechanisms, the modalities, the processes in and through which cities learn from each other. So I guess the first of my 6 points, and I think this is particularly appropriate given the substantive focus of the session, was the mix of academics and non-academics that spoke. Of course, academics are just one of a number of knowledge producers. There's a division of labour, if you like, between different stakeholders in the production, circulation, distribution, evaluation and so on of urban knowledges. So thinking about city-to-city learning necessarily, I would argue, involves thinking about where we, as academics, are situated vis-à-vis others, such as UNHABITAT and the World Bank Institute. And this, in quotes, location often reflects different traditions of scholarship. And thinking about academics as generators of knowledge that fuel the processes through which cities learn from each other. So I guess just thinking about how we are located in relation to consultancies, governments, social movements, think tanks, and what ethical or moral responsibilities do we have as our work travels. So it was interesting to hear academics being talked about, Saskia Sass and Mike Davis, here talk about the shift from government to governance. Those of us who've been working in urban studies for more than 10 or 15 years will remember academic conferences where things got quite heated about the definitions of government and governance, and that kind of fizzled out, and those terms are now, and have been for a while, circulating amongst those who make policy. So in the first talk today we heard about geographies of responsibility in relationship to city leadership. But I guess what's our responsibilities as academics? Second, and this was something I think raised by both Anna and Andrew yesterday, and that is the ways in which cities learn from each other, by which I mean the mundane and ordinary activities and practices of urban policymakers as they seek out models, policies that are constructed as working. So Tim used the term scanning, for example, study tours, visits, and the way these figure in a range of cities in terms of how they learn from each other. So going to places physically, seeing how a city does something, and then seeking to generalise. And often we tend to focus on the spectacular, the extraordinary, rather than the ordinary. And actually some of the kind of informal things we heard about in the four presentations today just remind us that actually sometimes it's the ordinary and mundane activities and practices that actually inform the ways in which cities learn from one another. Third, I guess, is that cities are embedded in contexts of different geographical reach. So urban, regional, national, international. They're not free-floating atom-like entities. There are structures and systems that have emerged over the years that reinforce or undermine the capacity of some cities to be learnt from. So there are pre-existing relations that render some cities as more likely to be learnt from and other cities as those likely to do the learning. And someone, I can't remember which one of the four speakers, used the term, I think it was Tim, the transnational tracks. So cities are interconnected in a myriad of ways, and these networks are one shot through with existing notions of uneven development. So in what ways, I guess, does the learning between cities have the potential to transform a city's place in the world? Fourth is the different informational infrastructures that have emerged, been sustained in different areas of policy making. So whether it's climate change, drugs, education, safety, transport, welfare, the mechanisms that exist in and through which cities learn appear to differ. So we heard, I mean, it's interesting and fascinating, we heard about centres of excellence, conferences, incubators, labs, reports, toolkits, websites, webinars, all different kinds of, and the last speaker used the term modalities, but all different kinds of ways in which there's an informational infrastructure that's been produced and sustained and nourished. And that shapes in those different sectors the kind of arrangements in and through which cities learn. So what technologies are at play in terms of shaping the ways in which cities learn? What are the key institutions in those sectors? And is learning always driven by well-resourced formal networks, or does the learning occur through more ad hoc informal means? Fifth, and I guess given the focus on this session, it makes sense to think about what we mean by learning. People have even gone to the lengths of writing books about learning and how cities learn. I think we heard today different notions of learning being named and mobilised, and that's fine. We heard a lot about how leaders of cities learn from each other. Yesterday we also heard about how others in cities learn from each other. It's not just cities, different stakeholders, different social movements, different actors. Now, given that city-to-city learning is one of the foundational elements of this programme of research at Oxford, it would be interesting, I guess, to explore what the case studies reveal about notions of learning. You know, is it always instrumental, or is it always rational? Can we always say we know when a city has learned? Putting cities and those that run them in the same room or on the same website, passing them information, does that necessarily mean that cities have learned? How do we evaluate whether a city has learned? Is it a simple input-output model, for example? I'd argue no, but I think this kind of programme of research that's been going on here for a while and clearly is going to roll out over the next few years is worth thinking about how we understand learning. And six, I guess, and finally, is how we as academics research city-to-city learning. So we started, and rather neatly, ended the session with a world map with lots of dots and lots of lines, which I like. I'm a geographer, so I like a map, and it looks clean and neat and tidy. We heard about analysing documents, about discourse and textual analysis. Tim presented an image of a book cover, and he used that image to read, if you like, certain cultural and social aspects of urban politics. We heard about participant observation and semi-structured interviews, and Tim hinted at some of the kind of fledgling work that he and others are involved with in terms of multi-site ethnographies. So being there, seeing how people learn, or speaking to stakeholders. So I guess a programme of research like this, and those of us who are interested in thinking about how city-to-city learning occurs, might think about how we can push, if you like, the methodological envelope. Thanks.
Karalampa Focus, University of Oxford. Listening to the speakers, I got the impression, and do correct me if I'm wrong, that somehow this city-to-city learning is neutral. And yet, I would find that a bit concerning. For instance, are engineers from one city to another learning how to build unsustainable car-based traffic systems? Or are city managers learning how to attract developers in building socially inequitable gated compounds? How do we make sure, and especially really from the last speaker, that this city-to-city learning is somehow progressive rather than regressive?
I have another question in me.
Thanks. My question follows on from that, and I thought it was a really coherent and well-informed panel, so thank you for some really lovely papers. But one of my concerns with the academic focus on the types of city-to-city learning that are taking place is that I think that we miss out on the real power. We don't look at the professions. And it seems to me that the way that the professions are organized and those networks are probably much more formative of cities than on particularly the politicians' visits to each other. And we may be looking at the right thing, but in the wrong places. And I wondered if you could comment on that across your cities.
Could you just say a little bit more by what you mean by the professions? Is that business?
No, not business necessarily. Business would be one example, although business is always interesting because it's not necessarily organized as a profession. But transport engineers, for example, meet regularly and are deeply influential in setting the code, setting the practices. And so there's an alternative network of the dissemination of ideas, of the encoding of practice, which it seems to me what we are not doing. So what is useful, and I thought Kevin's points really made were very crisp about, we need to understand these different registers of knowledge. But I think in opening up one, we look too closely. Michele won't mind me saying this, I don't think at all. But we focus, for example, on city development strategies. And if you look at any city, particularly in a city in the global south, city development strategies are not what are formative of the urban experience, the urban form of urban change. Municipal finance managers who meet in a different universe through accounting practices, et cetera, are formative, and we don't look at those practices. And so it seems to me we need to be asking perhaps similar questions, but in very different ways. We're interviewing the wrong people, is what is my proposition to you.
Thank you. Please.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Robert Huxford. I'm director of the Urban Design Group, which is one of these professional networks, and I also work with the Institution of Civil Engineers, which is a global professional network. And I would concur with what you've just said. I think the problem we've got it starts off with one of language. Ontological uncertainty. I read the phrase ontological uncertainty last year for the first time in connection with a paper on shared space. Now, could I ask the audience if you know what ontological uncertainty is? Would you like to raise your hand? 1, 2, possibly 2, 3.
Not sure.
You're not sure. Right. Do you know what shared space is? You're performing the answer. Do we know what shared space? Shared space? We know what. A lot more people know what shared space is, and apparently blind persons are afflicted by issues of existential anxiety and ontological uncertainty when using shared space. Now, this is very interesting. I actually did a survey. I'm sure you can guess what proportion of civil engineers would be able to understand what ontological uncertainty is, and it's probably very, very close to absolutely nil. So I did a survey last year. I asked people what ontological uncertainty was, and it took me 6 months before I could find somebody who knew what ontological uncertainty was, and they happened to be a classics teacher. Now, what I've heard over the past nearly 24 hours is an avalanche of pseudo-Greek Latin jargon, which is incomprehensible to normal people. If you stood in the street and waited until you could find somebody who knew what ontological meant, well, in an ordinary street, you could be waiting a long time. In that particular street, you probably wouldn't wait for very long because the Yiannopoulos Centre, I think it's the world's leading classics centre, is just down the road. They would probably, that street is absolutely streaming with classicists. So, the upshot is we have a major problem, I think, in this forum of using a language which normal people can't understand apparently ourselves, we can't understand it, and without that understanding, it's not really possible to critique the papers that have been presented in a meaningful way. And what happens is a proliferation of lack of understanding. So may I make an appeal that we try to convey these subjects in simple, straightforward language that is in common usage. Thank you very much.
Can I get the panel? I'm not going to ask you individually to ask what ontological uncertainty actually is. I'll save you that embarrassment. But can I get you each to say, respond to those three comments plus the more general and I think very perceptive comments that came from our discussant, Kevin?
I'll attempt to answer some of that with some epistemological certainty. I just want to say it's a very good point that we are treating city-to-city learning as a neutral space, that, you know, there is bad practice. And I remember how India wanted to be like China when they saw the wave of urbanization. And Mumbai wanted to be Shanghai. But today we know that, you know, China actually did not achieve the kind of density it wanted. The sort of infrastructure that they built is really huge and unsustainable, and so on. So one thing we have to say, that when things are happening and they look good, there is not always a way to establish whether this is good practice or best practice. Some of the times it comes from hindsight. You know, the whole world was looking at China. It wasn't just people who didn't realize the implications or did not know what this would lead to. So I think a whole lot of that is when I talk about iterative learning and learning from good practice or what went wrong. And now we're also talking about, you know, not just good practice, best practice, but the next practice. And how do you take that big step and innovate and be resource efficient? But I absolutely agree that this is not a neutral space, that cities, you know, do learn from bad practice and want to emulate that. And how do we actually go about bringing evidence-based, data-driven policies, you know, which are supported and are not just aspirational. Secondly, I think on the professions, Sue mentioned that, and I agree that, you know, we do work in silos. We work in silos of engineers, of urban planners, of you know, designers, and so on. But I think that's where a multi-stakeholder collaborative way of looking at where the city is going is very important. And I don't think we are doing enough on that front.
Yeah, I think I'd like to take the last two questions. I think it's true. The academic focus appears to miss the learning that's going on in the practitioner's domain. And it's true that listening to some of the presentations here yesterday and looking at the perspective of what we hear from municipal officials clearly demonstrates that gap that seriously needs to be bridged. City-to-city learning will clearly require a two-way conversation epitomized in what I actually reflected as the evolution of the safety approach. The approach that we actually are using as based on learning that the municipal practitioners have presented that made our first approach to safety, which was heavily academic driven, as not applicable to our municipal institutional frame. And where we are now is in an evolved setup that the municipality out of practice has evolved an approach that works for them. I think it is true that we need to begin to interview those who really are involved in the formative aspects of cities. In terms of language use, I think this has come over and over again in conversations with member states and cities. And clearly, as we speak to the terms of urban here, I always asked, if we had city leaders sit here, what would they actually take from here to apply to their local realities? And I see one of the two has to bend, and it clearly should be the academics that really begin to take on the language that the municipal practitioners do understand. I think this is really the challenge, rather than the other way around, that the municipal practitioners begin to grapple with the terms that we actually put across on the table.
Do I need to shout? Okay, thank you. I'll start with the first question about learning as neutral. I mean, so one of the motivations for me embarking on the project in Solo was precisely that from my reading of literature and Indonesian studies on more than a decade of decentralized governance there, so much of the existing academic writing has been about negative outcomes, about how cities across the archipelago are all serially doing the same kinds of things in terms of building shopping malls, building gated communities, often land which is forcibly appropriated from more marginal members of cities. So in my case, the very focus on that particular city is precisely meant as a counterpoint to the very thing that you're talking about. Again, whether what I'm talking about is actually socially progressive is a different matter in itself, but that was certainly part of my motivation for focusing on that particular city. In terms of the kinds of study tours involved, well, I started from what I observed in the city, and this happened to be municipal study tours. They may well intersect with all kinds of professional networks, but that just wasn't the starting point from what I've looked at. So it may well be that there are intersections which allow me to tap some of these overlapping but also differentiated networks that Sue alludes to, but they haven't been central to what I'm doing so far. In terms of methods, going back to some of the points that Kevin raised, I think there is a tendency methodologically to read learning outcomes from existing tangible evidence, such as the existence of a plan, the existence of a new marketplace, the existence of a particular policy. And one of the people who's been most critical of that is Jane M. Jacobs, who was actually originally supposed to be on the list of speakers here. So she says that a lot of scholars purport to follow policies and to follow the policy as a method. But what they actually do is they look at those cases where policy has already travelled and then trace back in time. And I think that the only way around doing that is, and to focus on learning rather than what has been learned perhaps, is ethnographic engagement. The kind of work that Elizabeth Rappaport's doing, following people on study tours. And it may well be that part of the outcome of that is that very little is actually learned, right? And there are very few tangible outcomes at the end of it, right? And we also know that embarking on that kind of research is very time consuming. It involves a certain level of access that we don't necessarily have. So it's not always open to us, but I think it's worth emphasizing that that is what much of the policy mobilities research literature has done to date. And lots of people are talking about ethnography, but not actually carrying it out. On the topic of the languages that we use, I don't know, perhaps it was a more general comment, but I hope that my own presentation wasn't that garbled or covered in jargon. But what I will say is that many of us who are researching on policy networks that extend across national boundaries are working in languages other than English. Yeah? Or maybe you think that the kind of jargon that I speak doesn't sound like English anyway, but I think as soon as you start to work across linguistic contexts, for me at least, it makes me very sensitive to the use of jargon, because when I'm in a situation where I'm trying to explain something in Bahasa Indonesia, and my Bahasa Indonesia is not great, I realise the difficulty that people must be having when I use a particular form of English. So I'm not really answering the question, but I'm saying that I think that it's important to bear in mind that many of us are working across languages anyway, other than English, let alone this distinction between some kind of jargonistic academic English versus other kinds of English.
You've said it all.
Yes.
I'm done. I second that, and that's it. No, yeah, I'll start from that then. I won't get started on the academic side. I think that there is a place for the academic discussion that gets into the jargon, gets into the meta theory, gets into the complicated nitty-gritty that is completely unintelligible. Maybe not in Oxford, actually, but to the normal person on the street. I think that there needs to be a sensibility as to where that happens and what's the purpose of throwing jargon on the table, because it's not the purpose of just throwing big words, it's the purpose of thinking through the way we think to then be intelligible to real people on the ground. So besides that, three quick things. I entirely agree, and I really like Kevin's idea of putting this in context in the informational infrastructure that shapes waves of learning, that shapes waves of sort of being a leader, of being a strategist, and so forth. And I agree entirely with Sue. Actually, one of the biggest mistakes one could do is reduce this kind of stuff to the policy only, and it happens quite a bit on policy mobility. It happened quite a lot in political science that dealt with this stuff before. You reduce it to the single policy or to the single mayor. Well, actually, this is an extremely complex context. Again, I agree with Tim, the kind of work that Elizabeth is doing, looking at the complexity of all the things and people and documents that travel in this sort of study tours, for example, is extremely fundamental. And I add that then in those networks, you cannot not put the positionality of the academic. Actually, the engineer, in the place that I currently sit in, the engineer is also an academic. My boss is an academic and an engineer, and sits in government. So that sort of divisions we need to be aware of unpacking those sort of divisions, because actually there's a whole lot of overlap. There's a whole lot of people that actually do multiple roles and multiple times. In our case, or in my case, the need is to try and anchor all of this into something, because the language of networks, the language of mobility, the language of flows can get very, very, very loose. So where do you start? Where's some points of anchoring that discourse into some actual systematic analysis? What do you start comparing? Can you do it real time? It would be brilliant if you don't do it retroactively. I agree with Jane 100% on that. And very quickly, I think the comment from the first gentleman, it's entirely political, actually. It's entirely the opposite. City-to-city learning or city-to-city connections. I cannot even conceive the idea of it being neutral. Even just talking about it as an academic, you should own, as Kevin basically was saying, you should own your positionality. You are also responsible by talking. We've done this with global cities. By talking about global cities, we've talked into reality certain languages and certain ideas of ranking, of connectivity, that have informed practice and have informed bad practice as well. And it's the same thing that happens with other things. And I think that what's fundamental there is having not just the legibility of all this research clear in mind, pushing the methodological envelope even further, getting the practitioner to inform the things that you look at. So not just go there and study people, get the people in the room in the first place and ask them how you do this kind of study. If you bring in a mayor from Accra or from Solo and so forth, they'll have their own ideas about how you do this, and they probably won't have much of a sense of what's actor-nectar theory, or why the hell you should do this in actor-nectar theory terms. And the way you push that methodological envelope is to bring it to the ground, is my point for looking with great admiration to people like Colin and people like Tim and so on, is spending the time on the ground, grappling with the actual stuff, standing in the loose, sorry if I put you, that you said we're not allowed to say the word, so we won't say the word, but standing in a loo in Mumbai or New Delhi and looking at what's the situation from the ground, going down to Solo and walking and getting a sense of it. So that's my 2 cents.
Okay, one thing we're really good at doing, whatever language it is talking a lot.
Yes.
That's sort of been a universal factor that is underlying all of the discussion here. But I think it would be appropriate. Can we just have what I would call a quick fire, very short questions, and then we just get the panel have the last word. Michael, you were first.
It's a brief comment rather than a question, which is, as someone who's had a schizophrenic life in 20 years or so in various political arenas, including as an elected politician and 10 years or so running a city hall, and life in academia as well, the term academic in one arena is a pejorative, and the term politician in another is a term of abuse. But I think we should be cautious. I have sympathy and also a disagreement with some of the comments. We should be cautious about making this a binary between academics and non-academics, because in an academic life I work in various academic disciplines, and if you sit, and I sit as an anthropologist of sorts in an economics lecture and listen to the maths of economics, the gap is significant. But equally I have sat with the chief economist at the Treasury, the senior planner from the Department of Communities and Local Government, and the head of medicine for East London, and the linguistic gaps as well will be as significant. They are as difficult. So I think we're talking, to be honest, I think it's wrong to polarize it as academics and non-academics. I'd actually echo Sue's point that I think we're talking about the ways in which expertise speaks. And I think in that context it becomes more about translation. And to be honest, if translation were an exercise that were not difficult, we would not have to learn it. But if it were not, if it were impossible, then we wouldn't try. And so I think we should be thinking about predisposition to translate, and then how we translate these languages, because I think they're as significant. I think this is Abha's point. I think the silos are as strong in these different sites as much as between the sites, between the academy and the ivory tower inside and out.
Number two, please.
Thanks for a really interesting panel. I want to come back to the question that Kevin raised at the end of his comments, which was how do we evaluate whether or not a city has learned? And in this, I think it's nice to come back to what Michele was just saying about bringing in the focus on everyday life. So looking at the corner shop rather than necessarily focusing on leaders or even the professionals. But what I wonder is, A, how do we do this? And then B, so I think Juma raised the point that, in order to facilitate city-to-city learning, somebody has to pay for it, right? So somebody has to fund these study tours. And eventually the people funding this learning are going to want to ask this question, how have we learned? And there's going to be evaluation frameworks that come in. So maybe this is a question for Abha and Juma. How are we going to evaluate this? And then how is that process of evaluation of whether we've learned actually going to then feed back into shaping the processes that we use?
There were two down.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a question to Tim. I will certainly be looking forward to further findings from your research. I found it really interesting. I had a question about your recognition of the actions by the mayor of Solo being very positive and equitable, particularly in case of the relocation or provision of new shops for the street vendors. I think you recognize this is quite an unusual situation across Asia, across Africa, normally speaking, actually. That doesn't happen, certainly not across the board. The devil is often in the detail. Some vendors might be relocated, others are not. And of course you need to understand what's happening in its totality to be able to make that judgment of whether or not this is a good thing. But let's accept it's actually across the board implemented well. Then given this being such an unusual case, my real question is, so what political formations or configurations made this possible? And you raised the issue of political leadership, but what about political practices and configurations or political action by groups of these street vendors or other citizens who are being relocated? Maybe you can say something about it, because it really, if it's such an unusual case, it may have some real implications for the portability or mobility of, or the lack of mobility of this particular case and the politics behind it.
The last question was, yeah.
Yes. Two very quick questions. First, are we sure that we know what kind of knowledge? Are we sure that we know what kind of knowledge we should transfer from one place to another? I've heard many times evidence-based, okay? But we're talking about very complex processes and things. Eventually, evidence-based could be tricky, or could be a high expectation in terms of determinism and so on. But in many cases, we deal with place-specific phenomena or indeed things. So probably, are we talking about more of usable knowledge in pragmatic terms, knowledge that can be used in different contexts accordingly? Second question, and I appreciated the comment on the urban design side, but I am concerned about the fact that as academics and as professionals, it is hard to accept uncomfortable knowledge which goes in contrast to the disciplinary boundaries that we build in order to advance in our academic career, or to promote our professional group as the one being capable of doing urban design. Whatever urban design is, we don't know what that is. Maybe there are different interpretations, but we have So in this sense, are we ready to speak the truth about these kind of problems, despite the fact that could affect our way of carrying along, surviving in our academics or professional life?
Thank you. Can I get Tim to answer the specific question, the solar question?
Sure. Okay, so yes, thanks for the question. The on-the-ground evidence is, of course, that it's much more complex than I have to summarize in 15 minutes, right? And it partly depends on which sites you look at. It does seem that some of the early flagship sites of relocation do seem to have been genuinely successful, as far as I can find out. Some of the later ones that the mayor himself was not so directly involved in, in the relocation sites, for example, a number of the vendors have found it difficult to make living in the way in which some of the early ones did. So it's by no means as generalizable a positive experience as I've had to abbreviate for the purposes of this presentation. What made this possible? Well, of course, if you ask people in Indonesia, especially in the city, they just say Mayor Jokowi, right? And of course, as an academic, you're always looking for something else, right? You don't want to accept that that simple response. I mean, one thing I will say, that it does seem to me that this is a remarkable person, and this is a remarkable person who put a great deal of effort and charisma into a whole series of negotiations which he led himself. That's indisputable, but of course there's always other things as well. So he had a deputy mayor, for example, who was very well plugged in with a particular political party, which had on-the-ground networks which could be mobilized in a series of contexts. And also, although, for example, this whole notion of people-centered development, it's actually from, I don't speak Javanese, but it's a Javanese term, Nuang Kei Wong, or something like that, right? Everybody tells me that, oh, Jokowi is the living embodiment of Nuang Kei Wong, which is people-centered development. And if you look at the historical documents, this was actually a particular philosophy that was enshrined in local government before Jokowi became mayor. Right? So there's a whole series of things that have been happening, and in some ways he was there at the right time. So there was also some pre-existing participatory planning that was going on, led by certain NGOs in the city, which meant that the ground was already there for this admittedly charismatic and energetic leader to have a very important role, which is undeniable in my view.
Could I get Michele and you, Juma, just to talk about the evaluation issue that was raised? How do we evaluate learning?
Well, I think that that's one of the crucial matters at stake. That even just the idea of thinking through evaluation pushes you to do more than what's been done thus far. There's this tendency of stopping at the network, stopping at the thing that has traveled, stopping at the policy. Well, isn't that the beginning, at least in my mind, isn't that the beginning of the question? So stuff might have traveled, or we might have gotten to a policy, so what? If I can just blatantly steal from Steve, and his paper later on in the next session. My understanding, or his understanding, and I entirely agree with, of that matter is the network and the mobility and the transfer and the politics of knowledge that sit behind this are all very interesting. But how do you evaluate impact? Well, you have to look for where that knowledge, whatever knowledge is and whoever knowledge is, has been somewhat locked in, has been somewhat become a path dependency, and not just a political path dependency, not just a rhetorical path dependency, not just a thing that gets repeated in a strategy. I've seen this in plenty of strategies that just self-refer back. Something that becomes a lock-in in the mundane, that has an actual everyday impact. How have we learned picking up rubbish in a certain way in Melbourne? Well, because it's finally gotten to Melbourne, and it has become a practice in the everyday life of people. So you have to confront that thing. It had an impact because it exists tangibly, physically, very materially. I'd say it.
Thank you.
Get to that.
Juma, anything?
Yeah. I think we can only evaluate learning to the extent that knowledge is usable, if I may use the word that he used, to translate into practice. For as long as we have a reality where we generate knowledge that does not actually translate into the way cities function, clearly our foundation of evaluation is misplaced. And this speaks to what we actually are moving away from, evidence-based to evidence-gathered, which is basically also an appreciation of no one-size-fits-all context. In as far as evaluation is concerned, it also speaks to what the first comment was trying to allude. In my understanding, I basically, yes, put the bridge, the gap between research and practice. But I agree that it's the way expertise speaks to practice. Mm-hmm. And evaluation can only be as good as understanding the institutional realities of where that practice is. I tend to understand that local government is very little understood by the academic discourses, and to such an extent that we do not really measure the capacities that we are actually speaking to. And so much of the knowledge ends up not being usable. There needs to be a sort of coming to terms with these two different worlds and try to as much shape the knowledge that we are generating to fit that particular context called the city and the local government.
Abha, would you just like to pick up as well on the last question on knowledges and the difference?
I actually wanted to pick up on the question on evaluation. And it's a very, very hard topic, because I think if you have a long-term engagement with a city and they are embarking on a project or they're embarking on something new, you can actually follow the learning and implementation for 3, 4, 5, 6 years and see whether it actually made a difference or not. So if a city is putting in, let's say, rapid bus transport, a BRT, and you take them to Bogota and say, this is how Bogota did it, this is how many people it connected, and this is how it reduced congestion, but they also had problems because they did not get any value capture of the land around the big bus stop. So these were the pros, these were the cons. And then if you see over 3, 4 years, how does this city actually design a BRT program, you can, in fact, see whether they've learned or not. But day-to-day learning is very tough. It's even tough to capture for students. I mean, do we have a methodology to say, are my students learning? And if you listen to Sal Khan from the Khan Academy, he says the reason that his Khan Academy that teaches math, biology, everything to young kids is far more, has a much better impact on kids is because they are able to teach kids at a different pace and in fact evaluate through technology how much a kid has learned, how much has he or she retained, and then what is the next module they're going to go to. I don't think we do that in Oxford or Cambridge or Harvard or MIT. So, you know, I mean, learning is very, very difficult, but the way that the World Bank looks at it is that evaluation is very important for us. Capacity development framework and results are important, and we do track it, but then there's a first level evaluation. You took this course, was it useful? Did it impact the job that you're performing? Are you going to do your job better? Did you 6 months later, did you stay in this job? Did you continue to do this, or did you use it to move to something else where you never ever will get the chance to apply what you've learned? So I think it's a tough question and hard to measure, but I think if you're staying in a long-term relationship with a city or an institution, you can. On the evidence-based thing, you know, Bloomberg's famous quote is that, "In God we trust, but for everything else, give me data." So evidence-based is important. If you're saying that, you know, you took certain measures to bring down crime and violence, and, you know, whether you put public lighting or the sort of awareness campaign you had, or you put more police, or you got community policing, one should be able to measure it in 2 or 3 years, whether the crime statistics came down, or did the reporting just fall off, or you know, so there are ways. They are intensive, but I think that data-driven evidence-based is a very, very relevant way of still capturing lessons and, you know, applying them to different situations. I wouldn't just dismiss that at all.
Thank you. You've been very patient. I realise that coffee's probably cold now, so you want. Before we go, can I just again, sharp, yeah. Can I just again thank our 4 speakers and Kevin, our discussant. It's been great.